Hi, this is a video response to my friend Rick over at DTG Taiho Jutsu. In your most recent video you cited two examples, excuse me, it's awfully hot here, I'm sweating. You cited two examples of stories. The first was designed, I guess, to elicit disapproval, and the second was designed to elicit empathy. Now, in the first story, you were in a hospital with, I believe it was your father, and a family member had just died of, I think it was cancer, and a big thug came up and picked a fight with your father, and it eventually ended up swinging at you, and you had to subdue him. And your general point here was, why are people mean? Why do people have to be mean? And then in the second instance, there was a gentleman on the train whose wife had just died and his kids were behaving terribly, and another passenger complained to him about the behaviour of his kids, and the guy kind of snapped out of a distracted state he was in and said his wife had just died, and the idea was, well, you never know what has just happened to people, so you should have some empathy. But I would suggest to you, Rick, that these are both sides of exactly the same coin, because when the guy's wife has just died, you feel sympathy for him, even though his kids are making other people's lives a misery. You have tolerance for them, yet the guy in the hospital who's an animal. Now, I'm not trying to make excuses for him, I'm not saying that he isn't an arsehole, and I'm certainly not saying that you shouldn't have defended yourself against him, but there is quite compelling evidence to suggest that we're all deterministic. That's to say that the people we become are a result of nothing more than the consequences of our life. So, for example, in the case of the second guy, his response was his behaviour was an immediate response to the death of his wife. But the first guy, there could have been equally compelling causes. He could have had an arsehole for a father who beat him every day for 20 years. He could have had all manners of situations. His wife could have died prematurely 20 years ago and it scarred him and made him the person he is. And he may have no more control over the person he became than the guy in the train that you felt sympathy for. And recent science has come up with some really disturbing revelations about the way the mind works, which shows that the conscious decisions that we believe we make are actually unconsciously made as far as 10 seconds ahead of the time when we reach the conscious awareness of having made a decision. Now, that's quite startling, because that says that nothing that you think you decide is actually consciously arrived at. It's all a process of your subconscious mind coming to the conclusion that, and your subconscious mind can work on many, according to many criteria and many stimuli, if you like. But if they're completely subconscious, you can have no control over those. It was suggested at one stage that the entire universe was deterministic, that in a sense, from the moment of the Big Bang, all of the atoms and all of the components of the universe were set in motion, and everything was just determined according to the laws of physics and nature. Now, that has been somewhat disproven by quantum theory, which suggests now that there is a quantum level uncertainty and randomness where things just pop into existence and out of existence. So things don't just naturally go from A to B. But as far as the human mind is concerned, it certainly seems to be the case that we are not in control of the decisions that we make. And the factors that have formed you to be who you are. I'm reminded of the great martial arts masters, many of whom only found the motivation to become masters in result of traumas that happened in their own lives. There are things that happened to them or things that happened to family members, and that gave them sufficient motivation to go forwards and train long enough to become determined and become a great martial artist. And likewise, villains may well be responding to equal stimuli and just responding differently. So, for example, if you're raised in a household where the values that you are imparted by your parents are positive values, then you may respond to situations positively. So you may see a situation and consider, how can I be kind, how can I be patient, how can I be helpful, and if you are raised in a poor household, then the responses that you have to situations may be negative. So your first instinct, for example, if you live in a household where your father hits you every day, your first instinct may be to hit you, may be to lash out with your fist. Now, my next door neighbour, she's well, it's a couple with lots of kids, and they're not unpleasant people, but they're certainly not model parents. And the woman in particular shouts and screams at her kids. You can hear them all the way down the street sometimes, and swears at them horrifically. And now, what, surprise, surprise, her two young daughters, one's 13 or 14, the other's probably 11 or 12, and they both have a mouth on them that is the equal of their mother's. They're both extremely rude to each other. They're bullies to each other. They're bullies to their little brothers, and they're extremely offensive to their mother and to other people. And you often hear them around the estate screaming at other kids as well. So they are a direct product of the parenting that they have received, and they view the world in terms of the way they were raised. So really, just a thought for you here, Rick. I'm really challenging you to challenge your own preconceptions, I guess. That the guy in the first case deserved contempt or disapproval because he behaved how he did, and the guy in the second case deserved sympathy. Now, I believe Sam Harris gives an example. He says, if you are out in the woods and a bear attacks your partner and kills your partner, how do you feel about that? And you feel devastated. You may even go and hunt the bear, but you certainly don't consider it personal. However, if you're out in the city and a mugger attacks your partner and kills your partner, then you are far more offended. Yet the person that mugger is may well be as much a product of nature and environment as the bear. They're just behaving true to their nature. And of course, that doesn't mean that we simply ignore crimes, but especially in America, which imprisons more of its population than any other country in the world, including, strangely, North Korea, perhaps there ought to be a better way to deal with crime, and a more sympathetic way of viewing crime. I'm just going to stop the video now because I suspect I'm going to go over time, and I'll continue in a second. Now, one issue that particularly that I find particularly provocative, especially if you consider it in the context of, say, Anders Breivik, who killed all those kids in Norway, is the concept that, or rather the question, what if incarceration and punishment was not the optimal way to produce positive benefit for society? So, obviously, with a country that incarcerate so many people, that system is obviously not working, because America is continuing to incarcerate more and more and more people. Now, I can't remember, Rick, whether you live in Canada or America. I believe you live in Canada, but in America, obviously, where so many people have been put away, it's clearly having neither a deterrent nor reformative value in changing people's behaviour. So, what if the solution to criminal behaviour or antisocial behaviour, because I don't really consider smoking drugs or even taking drugs to be criminal, to be honest. It has been made a criminal statute, but that's not to say that it's immoral or really criminal in any real sense of the word, because it's a victimless crime. If you're a user, obviously, if you're a dealer, then that may be a different issue. But supposing, for example, let's look at an extreme example on Anders Breivik. Now, if you look at his history, his mother considered before he was even born that he was going to be trouble, and she raised him really dreadfully. And even when he was in court fighting for his life, essentially, she still put her own needs ahead of his protection, her ego ahead of his protection, and she really was a very, very unpleasant woman. And again, you could argue that deterministically that she is a product of whatever happened in her life. But certainly, as far as Breivik is concerned, you can very easily look at the factors in his life and say, well, actually, it was very hard for him not to become the person he became. The forces pulling upon him from the very youngest age kind of shaped him to become this brutal killer. Now, supposing that sending Breivik to prison forever was not the best solution for society. Now, I guess in some senses I've chosen a bad example, because even if you look at Breivik with empathy or even sympathy and say, well, you know, he's not responsible for who he became, you could never trust him to allow him back out onto the streets again. But let's look at perhaps a slightly lesser case, the guy who punched you who tried to punch you at the hospital. Now, he's obviously a violent, unpleasant individual, and we'd all like to give him a good, strong punch in the chops, and from a purely self-defense point of view, I don't think anybody would argue that you shouldn't do that if he swings at you. But after that, what do we think we should do with a person like that? Should we punish him, or should we help him? You know, it could well be that he is dealing with issues from his childhood or issues in his current life which have made him that person. Now instinctively, we all seem to have a desire both for vengeance and for justice. But what if neither of those things actually produced a good outcome for society? So the justice is kind of the sense that almost like an eye for an eye, that if I wrong you, that you have a right to redress in some way which is appropriate to the level of the wrong that I've done. So if I murder you, the old biblical view would certainly say that you murder me back. And of course that leads to clan feuding and all of that kind of thinking. So that's clearly nonsensical. But even the idea that if I murder you, I should be sent to prison for 7 years. I mean that it does us all a disservice on so many levels. Notwithstanding the fact that it costs an absolute astronomical amount to imprison people, which you then have to pay for. But imprisoning people quite often criminalises them more. It increases their sense of resentment, it increases their criminal behaviour, it increases their criminal expertise, and the level of recidivism, that's the level of repeat offence after prison, is actually quite high. So obviously imprisoning people is not producing the optimal outcomes. If the optimal outcome can be said that what we actually want is what's best for society. So supposing you have a rapist, you may instinctively want to imprison him for life. And I guess, in one sense that may be the safest option, but it's certainly it's not really good for society because of the financial burden of keeping him there. But on the other hand, you don't want to let him free so that he can rape again, but if not putting him in prison in the first place, but counselling him and dealing with the issues that have led to him being a rapist, which are usually psychological, if they actually produce positive outcomes in the long run, because in most cases with rape or even child abuse, those people do eventually get out, and if they come out uncured, and not only uncured but now resentful and with an expertise in how to cover their tracks, then all we're doing is setting ourselves up for the future. So to go back to the situation with the guy who swung at you in the hospital, obviously he was an unpleasant person, but is he responsible for the unpleasantness of his behaviour? And I think that we can say that quite clearly he's not really consciously responsible, because although he thinks he makes a decision, the actual decision that is reached is made subconsciously long before his conscious mind reaches that decision. So he thinks to swing at you, but actually a part of his brain deep inside actually makes that decision. And another interesting thing is that our brains actually have multiple personalities, and I don't just mean like split personality, but when you hear that, you know, you had that decision making process you think that you go through in your brain, they're actually separate parts of your brain, and not just two, but multiple parts of your brain, and each of those can not only have differing opinions, but can actually have differing fundamental beliefs on things such as morality, religion, superstition, things like that, and they have a conversation subconsciously, and then they reach a conscious decision and they feed that to your conscious, and then you act. So, you know, this guy, who knows what forces were driving him, but perhaps we need to be looking at treatment of the mind rather than punishment of the body, because the body is really just the agent of the mind. It's not really responsible for its actions, and I know that may be deeply unsatisfying to hear that, and religious people particularly really love to lash out and punish, but if we're going to be a more civilized society, maybe we ought to understand a bit more about the way the mind works, and show equal sympathy, even though it may be unpleasant to do so, equal sympathy for the person who acts like a brute and the person who's grieving, you know, because they're both suffering from events that have affected their psyche. Anyway, Rick, thoughts for you to think about. A bit long-winded. I hope you don't mind, but I find this stuff absolutely fascinating. Hope you will too. You take care. Hey guys, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please take the time to rate and comment, and it would mean a lot to me if you would subscribe. Thank you.